This is an AlphaSmart Neo. This is a thermal electronic typewriter, a Brother EP43. It is a electronic word processor built into a keyboard with internal memory, a USB port to export the text to a computer. When I compare the Brother EP43 with the AlphaSmart Neo, I start to see quite a few similarities. Yes, they're both battery powered. I don't know how long the batteries last on the EP43, but I've had a set of C-cell batteries in here since I've owned it. They haven't died yet. The feel of the keyboard is very similar. It's sort of a mechanical computer keyboard reminiscent of the 1980s or 1990s. The technology of the AlphaSmart Neo is early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. The technology of this Brother is late 1980s. They're both mobile writing tools. They both have LCD screens. The similarities and the differences are both striking. In some sense, they're very similar to each other. They have a similar kinds of keyboard. They have portability. They have small form factor, lightweight. But on the other hand, the differences between these two are striking. This device records text to a nearly obsolete operating system, where the only way we can really transfer files is character by character in the send mode via a USB cable. This device, on the other hand, is a paper-based word processor. They're both electronic. They're both from roughly within a decade or so of being from the same era, but this one outputs to paper. Thermal typewriters are a lot like film cameras. They have a fixed technology that they were manufactured with. They depend upon, for their continued operation, the continued manufacturing of a medium. In the case of film cameras, that medium is film, and in the case of thermal typewriters, that medium is now thermal paper. Yes, these tools were originally designed to have cartridges that would thermally transfer a film onto normal paper. Those cartridges have been out of manufacture for decades. But these machines continue to be viable because they can be used with thermal paper. So they're like film cameras. This is the film that they depend upon for their survival. So there's a lot of similarities between both of these devices. Portable, lightweight, mechanical keyboards, battery operated, extended operational life with one set of batteries, LCD screen. They're very similar. But on the other hand, they're very different. You have a fairly fragile electronic operating system. There is no flash memory in this device. If your batteries inside here and the backup battery on the circuit board both fail, you have lost all of your text. So it is a fragile medium here, a fragile electronic medium. This, on the other hand, is paper-based. Yes, it's thermal paper. Yes, the markings on thermal paper will not last as long as the archivability of conventional ink or graphite markings on normal paper. However, this medium here is a lot more archival, a lot more stable than this. I don't know how many people I have heard who have used AlphaSmart Neos who report onto the various discussion forums or blogs, I just lost my whole work in my Neo because my backup battery went dead and my main battery cells got weak. But I've never really heard of anybody losing their work suddenly on a thermal typewriter. So it is a more stable medium because it's paper-based. And that is one of the differences between these two. They're so similar to each other, but they both demand two entirely different kinds of workflows. I was curious about the longevity of thermal printing on thermal paper because obviously you hear stories, everybody says, well, it's thermal, it's it's temporary. The markings are going to fade or the paper is going to turn dark. Which one is it, though? The only experience I've personally had with thermal paper is I remember I had a store receipt for something. I had a composition book with a black plastic cover laminated to a thin cardboard liner. And I remember I put that receipt into the front cover of the binder, closed it up, and left it in my car in the summer here in Albuquerque. And it was there for a few hours. And I got back out, opened up the composition book, and the receipt was completely black, dark gray, completely obscured, totally useless. Obviously, the hot sun in my car, the temperature of the car got up to probably well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and this black plastic notebook was sitting in the direct sun baking, and it basically acted like a thermal printhead and just printed the entire receipt dark. So based on that one experience, I had always assumed the problem with thermal printing on thermal paper is the paper eventually goes dark due to age. Well, interestingly enough, I was going through a bunch of old papers. This is a Hobby Lobby receipt, and it's dated December 21st, 2012. That's almost 7 years ago. And what's interesting is the front of the receipt has this kind of amber yellowish stain, and where that discoloration's happened, a lot of the thermal printing has faded almost to nothing. Instead of the paper turning black, it's sort of turned amber, but it's more what's happened is the thermal printed text has disappeared. And so the question I have is this faded part of the paper still thermal insensitivity? Well, so and the result is, yes, it still prints. So it's interesting. It's almost like the thermal paper still retains some of its thermal properties, so you can re-record new information onto the old paper. That's really interesting. So I've thought a lot about this, and I've had numerous conversations with people about this, about the future of typewriters. Going down 10, 20, 30, 40 or more years into the future, will we still have typewriters? Mechanical typewriters, most certainly we will, of course, and a lot of it depends upon how well we are able to keep them running. Electronic devices, it's interesting. Like a Neo, for instance, if the basic text format, the .txt, if that basic format of data is still relevant decades from now, and if USB connectors are still present in computing devices, this will probably still be a viable tool as far as at least being able to write a text in here and being able to send it with the send key, a character at a time, into a computer of some sort. Thermal typewriters, as long as the mechanism, the electronics, and probably the more fragile part of it is the little plastic gears that run, the toothed belt that runs the print mechanism and that runs the platen and all that, as long as all that is functional, the real problem is really about the thermal paper. And so based on this test here, it looks like if you have decades old thermal paper where the thermal printing has faded out almost to be totally invisible, it's almost like this can be reused. It's not quite as dense and dark as new thermal paper, but it's usable, which is interesting. So maybe, hypothetically, in the future, people will be hoarding used thermal paper and reusing them. Isn't that interesting? The thing that fascinates me about the relationship between thermal typewriters and AlphaSmart Neos is a lot of people in the typewriter world who are fans of manual typewriters seem to have not too many objections about these kinds of devices. I rarely see people criticize AlphaSmart Neos like, oh, I'd rather have a manual typewriter. That isn't a real writing device. People appreciate what this does, but A lot of times it seems the same people have a lot of criticisms to say about thermal typewriters. They'll say things like, that's not a real typewriter, that's too electronic, it's not manual enough. Couldn't you say the same thing about this? And yet these both have a lot of similarities. As I've said earlier, both of these very similar. Manual keyboards, LCD screens, portability, extended battery operation, being able to record onto some semi-fragile media, whether semi-archaic data formats versus thermal paper. And it seems like they both give you a very similar kind of writing experience as far as being a writing tool, which is interesting. But why then do these devices seem to garner so much criticism? And that fascinates me. Why the disparity there? Because I find both of these very similar in use. I like using this high-quality Brother thermal paper in the letter size format, nice and thick, and it sort of feels like a glossy magazine page, that thickness and smoothness and slickiness. These machines put out a really nice quality text. But for simple, down-to-earth word processing, getting the early stages of the writing process, recording your thoughts, a roll of fax paper, the inexpensive, cheap Staples brand fax paper like this. Nothing beats that as an easy way to do this endless scroll, like the Jack Kerouac on the road kind of writing philosophy. Sort of like this. There is a virtual scroll in an AlphaSmart Neo. You have this little LCD window. You can only view a little portion of your scroll, but you can scroll up and down. Here on the thermal typewriters, you can make a physical scroll in thermal paper, and they're very efficient writing devices for putting down a lot of words on paper that you can later edit and then enter into your word processor during the edit phase and the revision phase of your writing. Both of these machines are great machines. I find myself, though, gravitating toward the thermal typewriter more than the AlphaSmart Neo, even though with the AlphaSmart I need nothing else but it, whereas with the thermal typewriters I need some sheets of letter paper, thermal letter paper, or I need a roll of thermal paper like that, fax paper. I need to carry a little bit more. Yes, the machines are certainly similar in size, but they are different also. Certainly the thermal typewriter is a little bit heavier. The batteries are C cells or D cells. These are C cells in the EP43 versus 3 AA batteries in the Neo. So batteries, yes. Smaller, yes. A little bigger, yes, here. But I find myself gravitating toward taking thermal typewriters. It's the paper-based workflow that really attracts me. When I end up with a paper document like this, a recent journal article written on this letter size thermal paper, or this longer piece written on the scroll of fax paper. When I write stuff like this, I like seeing that paper-based medium. To me, there's a lot more things I can do with this. Like, for one of the ways that I output my writing is I'll make a blog article. Now, you can do blog articles. I have done a lot of blog articles in the past with an AlphaSmart Neo, and I will get into my blogger template, and I will put my cursor in it, and I will hit the send key on this, and it'll write itself into that window. I'll even have the hypertext markup language already written in the text for paragraph and line breaks and bolding characters and all that. But if I'm doing a blog article where I want it to be typecast, I want an image of a typewritten sheet of paper, I can do that with a thermal typewriter. I can scan or photograph this with my phone and put it up on my Flickr, link the link over to my blog. So thermal typewriters give me the ability to do typecasting. It also gives me a paper backup. This is a hard copy of this initial phase of my writing process. I archive these in notebooks. I have a record of the way I wrote, the date I wrote it, how I write it. If I want to take this piece and continue working with it at a future date into something else, and if I go through multiple stages of revision in this paper-based workflow, I have a record on every stage of the process of what that is like. Here is another piece I wrote, even longer, on the EP43. It is a record of a certain stage of my workflow, and I have all of these intermediate phases of my writing process documented on paper. So that's really the difference between these two devices. It really comes down to semi-archaic digital process versus paper-based workflow. It's an electronic word processor that outputs to paper. And I think that's fascinating. I like the Neos, don't get me wrong. I love my AlphaSmart Neos. But I really find these days the Neo is more fragile. The data, is more fragile. I really don't know one day to the next whether the data in my Neo is really going to be there when I turn it on. My batteries, I just checked it, they're full for now, but should something happen, maybe I get an oxidized connection on the main batteries and maybe my backup battery on the circuit board is weak. I've lost data before on the Neos. There's a lot of people that have, over the years, that have lamented the loss of data from these machines. As reliable and as good as they are, it's not as reliable as even thermal paper. Paper-based workflow is more reliable. I would like you to think for a minute about typewriters as writing tools more than devices that we obsess over as hobbyists. It's the typewriter as a writing tool. And you have the AlphaSmart Neo as an alternative writing tool and something like a thermal typewriter as another alternative writing tool. I've collected a lot of manual typewriters over the years, and I can tell you that both of these devices are more reliable than manual typewriters. In terms of a manual typewriter, there's always a little nagging problem happening. The most recent manual typewriter in my collection as of this date is this Smith Corona Silent Super that I acquired. And just last week, as I was typing on it, when I got into my second page of my journal, it started piling up letters. The carriage wasn't moving freely. The touch started binding. Clearly the machine needs more degreasing and cleaning and service. But as fragile as electronic devices are accused of being, in the short term at least, I have a lot less problems with them. Now maybe down the road, maybe 10 or 20 years, these might not be working at all, or maybe if the big EMP happens, these will all be fried and we're left with manual typewriters. But at least in the short run, the time that really matters if you're a writer and you need a reliable writing tools, either one of these is a very much more reliable tool, I've found, than a manual typewriter. The best typewriter in my collection might be my Olympia SG3 right over here. And even that, sometimes, if I give it just the wrong touch on my hands, not quite as much snappy force, it's going to do some little thing once in a while. Is that a showstopper? No, not really, but it can be a distraction to the creative process. Well, I'm not trying to convince you of anything in this whole video. I'm not trying to talk you into throwing away your AlphaSmart Neo and getting a thermal typewriter. It's whatever you want to do, but I wanted just to share my thoughts about this, that these two devices are simultaneously very similar and very different. A lot of physical similarities, feature similarities, and yet fundamentally they're so different because this uses a semi-archaic electronic-only format. This uses a semi-archaic paper-based format. And it's up to you to decide whether you want a paper-based workflow or a totally electronic workflow. Either one of these are great tools, but I have discovered in the last year or so that I really gravitate toward thermal typewriters now, and my Neo doesn't get nearly the use that it used to, even though it's lighter and thinner and a little easier to carry around than a thermal typewriter. I just like the paper workflow. I like the idea that a more sophisticated electronic device is serving the needs of a paper workflow. I like the consistency of the print quality in thermal typewriters. I appreciate the ease of use of the keyboard. As I age, have arthritis in my hands, it's a lot easier to type on one of these. And so that's my thoughts for today. I'd like to hear your thoughts down below. What do you think about the AlphaSmart Neos as a writing tool? And what do you think about the possibility of thermal typewriters as a writing tool? How do you think these two kinds of devices compare or contrast? I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. And as always, until next time, stay creative and have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye.